All right, we're live. Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan, and this is my co-host, Zongjun.
Hello.
And we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, so we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we're happy to have Paul from Tea Nursery. So Paul and us met during our last sourcing trip in Japan, and we learned so much about the tea industry in Japan, and we kind of felt the need to invite you as a guest. And we definitely indulged a little bit when we were writing the questions that we want to ask. So Paul, can you maybe share a little bit about your background and how you came to start Tea Nursery?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that was quite a long list of questions. We will see what we can cover today. Well, my name is Pau. I'm from Spain, from the Catalonia region. So that's my background is in coffee. I started when I was in university as a barista kind of part-time job, and then you end up like liking more the job than the studies in a way. And I work in that company for 7 years. Mainly in the coffee side, and head trainer, and like I ended up doing some quality control for coffee and stuff like that as well. But they also operated a tea shop as well. In that tea shop, they had like quite a wide variety. So from like more like basic, super blended, dried fruit kind of infusions, all the way up to pours and like crazy white teas and gyokuros and so I was like exposed through there. I was like, okay, that sounds interesting. Sometimes for covering lunch breaks for people, I would just like help in the tea shop. And that's where it comes from, the tea at the beginning. Yeah, years passed and I wanted to just like switch to tea. So I always try to study as much as possible about the topics that interest me. So I just really started digging very deeply into tea, and I did some online education courses with some associations out there. Then I visit Japan for a tea master course for 2 weeks last year, June of last year, July, something like that. And then I had the opportunity to work for a year in a tea farm in Japan. So I took that opportunity, which like really skyrocketed like all the knowledge and taking notes every day and like trying to live the tea in a way. Now I work in a tea farm, so it's been a huge transition. And the Tea Nursery, which is my blog, that was 2 years ago, exactly like next month, I believe. And it was part of like this gathering of information for me to learn, or like a way just to share it with others as much as possible. I don't have the time to write too much, but I have like a lot of piled up content that hopefully will roll out eventually. But I specialize in very technical details, as we might talk about later. So it was just like wanting to share.
Your blog is incredible.
Thank you. Like it's so technical that sometimes it's like, okay, it's actually like this is just too nerdy. Is it too much, too technical? But people seem to enjoy it because it's highly specialized in things that either you need to learn a lot of Japanese to be able to read it, or just to spend a lot of time between translation tools, and it's a little bit of a pain. So yeah, but that's a little bit how it came to be, I guess.
Thank you for doing it. It really is an incredible service for anyone who wants to learn about cultivars or the regions or really the technical details behind how things were bred or invented. Like it's been my active reading list, and I'm slowly chomping through all the articles, back reading everything, and I'm learning so much that you just don't hear about in other pockets of the internet, at least in the English-speaking world.
That's one of the reasons why I like started writing the blog posts and putting them out there, because like I wanted to know about this thing, but okay, I have to read it in Japanese, and then it's like there is broad strokes here and there, but it's like that was not satisfactory for me. So I tend to just like go very deep into rabbit holes. So like I'm sure there is someone out there that would also enjoy that kind of content sometimes. So I'm glad to hear that you like it.
Yeah, well, as we are roaming through Japan, we realized that the language barrier is definitely a thing. Really gatekept a lot of very valuable information.
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult, like the language barrier. Sometimes, of course, like you are like just coming out of nowhere. They don't know you, you don't know them. Like, of course, people are a little bit more like closed. Most farmers are very happy always to to talk about their farm, about the plants. They are nerd out a little bit of like, yeah, my tea field is the best one in the region, blah blah blah. So after you meet them for a few times, they usually open up, and you can have like very nice, interesting conversations with them. But it takes a little bit of time sometimes. Yeah. It's a little bit more different if you are talking to more like the industry side or like more like the research centers. You ask questions. It's like, who are you? Like, why are you requesting this very specific copy of a paper just to read it? It's like, but yeah. But in general, they are very nice. The farmers is like, you also need to know like what you can ask at each stage of getting to know them. But that like just goes like as a personal relationship with other people as well.
Makes sense. Can you share a little bit about what it's like to work on a tea farm day to day? What is it like you do, and how does it change with the seasons, and how you interact with the people you work with? We'd love to learn a little bit more about like what does it actually look like to be a tea farmer full time?
Okay. So tea farming, according to other farmers in Japan that are not farming tea, is one of the craziest things that you can do, apparently. Like, I was going to help an association next to Wazuka in a city, well, a village called Tawara. It's in Nara prefecture, and they were planting kiwi trees. And they were like, "Oh, okay, like, are you here on vacation?" Or, "No, I work in Wazuka, I work in tea." They were like, "In tea, you're crazy. Like, that's the most heavy farming that one can do." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And I think like later that year I understood why, especially in spring. It's like winter is very chill. Like, there is not much to do on the fields. There's some weeding. There is, I don't know, winds or a tree fell down. You go and take care of it. Repair shading structures, stuff like that. But then from March is trim the bush. Then people start to fertilize bushes. Then you start maybe shading or a little bit more of trimming. Then weeding, preparing for harvest. Then when the harvest starts, it's just like all of those things happening simultaneously. Because you can be operating, I don't know, one field or 30 different fields. So everyone has different behaviors, different rates of growth, different weather environment. Basically, this year, I think we started working from the 11th of March in the fields. Harvest was the 23rd of April. I remember it very well. And from there, when I realized, it was August already. So yeah, it was very busy.
Wow.
So wake up in the
That sounds
morning,
intense.
go to the fields, have a lunch break, go to the fields, go to the factory, spend a lot of hours in the night processing tea, go to sleep, wake up, repeat. And that's your life for around 2 months for spring harvest. Then you get a couple days of relax, of rest, and then you start trimming again and fertilizing again and trimming and shading for summer and preparing for summer and a lot of weeding. And now we are in September, and now we are chilling a little bit, cleaning the factory, preparing for autumn harvest, which will be starting for us in maybe 3 weeks, 2 weeks, more or less. And then rinse and repeat. When you realize it's Christmas, and when you realize again it's March, and turn the engines on again and let's go.
It starts over.
It's probably one of the hardest jobs I have done in my life. It's very rewarding, but it's physically exhausting. And then have factory duty. For us, we do a lot of tea tourism activities and education activities. So you have that on top of the high amounts of physical work. But it's very rewarding. It's see how the plants behave, how do they grow, when do they suffer a pest. Disease is like at night, it's like, oh my God, is that field going to be okay? It's like a very deep personal connection with the...
That's cool. Must be so tangible to see it from, beginning to end.
Yes.
From like soil management and the weeding all the way through like tasting the tea. It's an experience so few people get to have, and we haven't really had that either. So it's It's
It's
awesome to
very
hear.
rewarding when you spend, I don't know, a couple days in the heat of summer, just like harvesting, and then you go to the factory and you're like sweating like crazy because it's like 39 degrees. And all the machines are running
Wow.
like at 90 degrees Celsius constantly for hours, and you're like just like keeping yourself hydrated as much as possible. And then you are like, oh my God, is the tea going to be okay? Is it too dry? Is it broken up? Is it too much dust? And then you try the next morning and it's like, okay, not that bad. Like a very rewarding kind of like, okay, the sweat and tears, but after all of that effort, the tea, it always rewards you in a way. It's a very rewarding experience to the next morning try the tea that you have harvested maybe 20 hours ago. It's a luxury, honestly. It's something that almost no one can like have such fresh tea. Because for matcha, of course, you need to like go tencha oven and grinding and aging and like all the steps. For sencha, it's a little bit more direct, but it's such a unique experience. And then you can drink that tea every day of the year, and every day you will see how it evolves from kind of the sencha flavors. It will mature a little bit. It will calm down, and then it gets like a little bit of a different flavor at the end of the season. It's truly a luxury. I feel very honored to be able to experience that.
That's awesome, tasting that transformation. So it moves from like very green notes, like Sincha, and then I guess it settles into itself. And you said
Yeah,
it really changes towards the end.
yeah. It
How
it,
does
it
it
kind of
change?
mellows during the year in a way. Like it can be very pungent, grassy, cut grass, like very green and sharp in a way. And sometimes the
Okay.
body is a little bit more on the light side. I'm a terrible taster, but that's what I felt at the beginning. Then maybe after 2 weeks, you kind of start to see like, oh, that sharpness is a little bit more like rounded out. And about the 2 to 3 months mark is when the body starts to develop. It becomes a little bit more sweet. That noise of like freshness noise in a way goes out, and it's a little bit more expressive, a little bit more like open. Sometimes you cup it in the morning and it's like, oh, it's like a little bit like, I don't know, maybe it's too grassy. Maybe we didn't do the processing right. And my boss and the head farmer are always like, no, just chill. Like let it be for a couple of weeks, and then we'll really know. It's too fresh right now to be able to evaluate it. And then after 6 months, I think
Interesting.
is the best time to drink the tea, to be honest. At least for me.
Is it when you have different cultivars in the beginning, when it's closer to Shincha and very fresh,
Oh yeah.
do they taste more similar and then taste more distinct as they get older, or is the difference immediately apparent, or it grows?
I think the general evolution is the same. Of course, different cultivars taste different, and some of them taste very, very different. If you compare, I don't know, something very early with Okumidori, which is extremely late cultivar, like of course they will taste very different because maybe there is like 3 weeks, 3 weeks and a half of difference timing wise.
Oh, because you can't even make the comparison.
Exactly. I mean, you could if you, I don't know, but then you have to source from different prefectures. It's not like you can have it from the same village or something like that. Like when we
Interesting.
harvest, I don't know, when we harvest Yabukita in one field, the closest field that has Okumidori, maybe we harvest it like at least 2 weeks later, I would say. Depends on the situation. Also, if you shade it or not, and you have to wait for the shading to develop a little bit more, that also affects. It's very difficult to compare. That's also something I want to focus more on this next year. Like really knowing the cultivars by the taste of them and see like what are the commonalities among all the kumidoris, because of course the farmer technique and the farmer field management will affect it so much, like the processing will affect it so much that it's very difficult to say like, oh, this is of course is okuhikari because it has this very particular note. There is commonalities, but if you burn it in the shaping machine, then it will taste like a hojicha, and that's not from the cultivar, that's just a mistake, which Sometimes it's a good thing. I have, during my practice runs, I have like scorched some tea sometimes, and there's like, oh well, it gives it a nutty taste. It's not so bad. Like it's interesting.
Paul, can you maybe give our listener some background information about cultivars? Like what are they developed in the first place and how do they being used right now in the contemporary tea industry?
So for cultivars, I think the vocabulary can vary industry by industry. Like there is this huge debate of cultivars and varieties and varietals, and like at least in the coffee industry. I think in the maybe you Zongjun, you know more about that, is the wine. There is also all this varietal kind of vocabulary going on.
With different grapes.
Yes. So a cultivar is a plant variety that is like cultivated. So it's a cultivated variety, something that you select out of a wild population, and you say, oh, this plant looks super beautiful, it's super tall, and the leaves look great. So you just like take that plant, identify it, and then you kind of, some crops can propagate through seeds, and the characteristics will carry on into the seeds. But most of the time, that's not the case. So that's when you do grafting or you do cuttings or whatever. What is a variety then? So a variety is a botanical term. And that's like subspecies of a plant. So they have characteristics that differentiate them from the main species, but they can still interbreed between them. So that would be Camellia sinensis, variety sinensis, and Camellia sinensis, variety Yumesumika. So both form part from the same family, the same species, but they have distinctive traits that we can say like, okay, this is obviously two different subspecies, but they can still crossbreed among themselves because they are very similar still. And those distinct traits, they usually carry into the next generation of the plant. And the cultivar traits, so that beautiful glossy green leaf, if you take seeds from that plant, those traits don't cross over. So to maintain those favorable things that you like, you need to propagate by cuttings. So a variety is like a little bit more of a broad subspecies kind of selection. Cultivar is this plant in specific. We like the traits of this individual genetic material, and you just clone it. Like if you could do clones of like, we really like that human, you will never get a copy of the same one. So you will have like to clone a human, right? And then varietal, which is something that we see like floating around, and this is a huge debate I have with a lot of people. Is not a science botanical term. It's more of like an industry term in a way. It's like super big in wine industry, coffee industry as well. It's more like an agricultural term. Like when you do a product that is a single variety, you can call it, it's varietal, whatever. But it's not like a technical, defined botanical term in a way. And I'm not a botanist, I'm not an horticulturist, so take all of this with a spoon of salt. But I hope that kind of clears a little bit the confusion that might be around it. And then the second part of the question,
very interesting.
I forgot. What are they? How they are made?
Yeah, that's right. Do like these cultivars made from, let's say, crossbreeding from some local tea research institute in Japan, or do farmers also do their own crossing? Like how do they generally get made, and how do they get their names from?
Okay, so that's interesting. So first of all, like for tea at least, like the first batch of registered cultivars, I think it was 14 or 15 of them, was in 1953. But of course, the research on those started much early, like 1860s, 1870s. So there was this guy, Motokichi, Tada Motokichi, he was a vassal from the shogunate. Then the shogunate fell. That's like a different story, but then it became a tea farmer, and the new government, the Meiji government, sent him to India and China to like, okay, the exports are growing. We want to export tea because it's one of our crops. And best thing, how we can improve our tea exports by mixing some better tea, better processing, or better plant, or whatever. So this guy went out, came back a couple years later with seeds from other plants that were not introduced in Japan. So that's genetic material coming more from the Asamica family. So in Japan, we work a lot with the variety of the Sinensis sinensis, not the Sinensis asamica. So most of the Asamica introduced places were firstly introduced by the Motokichi.
This is why Taiwan has Yumesumika too, because it was under Japanese rule at the time, I think. Because in Sun Moon Lake is a lot of Yumesumika, but I heard it was brought in by the Japanese. But maybe it's the same time period.
I'm not sure. Also, there is this situation where, proximity-wise, is probably Taiwan is way more closer to Assam and parts of China where they grow Asamica. So it could have naturally happened by trade as well from another source, like monks at the time. Like that's how tea was introduced in Japan. For the Tadamotokichi heirloom seed introduced, it came off like, okay, we want to go outside to see how we can better our tea. The difference with Taiwan and Japan, when Taiwan was under the rule of the Japanese, is like if both countries produce the same type of tea, then they are like, it's like a conflict of interest a little bit. Like they are cannibalizing themselves. So I think that's why they let those Asamica varieties specialize more onto the oolong side. And Japan tend to specialize their breeding more into the black and green. So they would not like conflict within each other. I might be wrong, but
Interesting.
It's a possible explanation. I have seen it mentioned somewhere that I don't remember, but definitely not something set in stone, I think. So from those seeds, they will take some seed, they will grow it, they will make seedlings, and then they will say like, okay, this tree, the leaves are too small. This tea, the leaves are too big. This one just died because of cold weather. And eventually they settled on like, okay, we have enough leaf amount from the ones that survived. Let's make sample tea. They say like, oh, the tea from this one in particular is amazing. So you select from a wild population. You don't know what you're getting. Once you try it, it's like, okay, we want this profile. And then you start propagating, get more trees so you can make more tea, so you can propagate even more and like reproduce the plant until you can make fields and fields of it. So that's like very old kind of style of crossbreeding, or like the first generations. Like there was no method. They were like figuring everything out, I guess. Actually, that's the material from 30s, 1940s. That's when Benihomare started. So they was singled out, or like, this plant has potential to become a black tea cultivar. And that was the one that would become cultivar number 1 in Japan. Not as in quality, but like registered as tea cultivar 01. And that was when Yabukita was registered the same year, Asatsuyu was registered the same year. So that's more like first generation cultivar registration. So they will take Zairai trees, which is trees grown mainly from seed, or like existing tea gardens. They will just like go and scout all the plants and select the plants that showed desirable traits. Then you move, it takes maybe 20 years, 30 years to make all this study, because most of the time you are waiting for the plant to grow enough to propagate it as well. Then maybe that was on the 50s, or maybe 60s and 70s, you start to see registered cultivars that come from Zairai, so the same situation. But you start to see a lot of like, okay, we know that Yabukita is good. Let's pollinize plants with pollen from Yabukita, or let's pollinize from other flowers on a Zairai field into Yabukita flowers. And genetic lottery will give us, 7,000 seeds. From those 7,000 seeds, we will grow them, see what happens, and maybe we end up with 2 cultivars at the end of the process that we like. So that's more like second generation cultivar. That would be maybe from the 60s and 70s. Tsuyuhikari. No, Tsuyuhikari was quite recent. cannot think of a cultivar from that period of time right now.
Who is paying for this? This wasn't tea farmers, right? Because this sounds like an incredible amount
Well,
of
it was a
labor and
combination
effort.
at the time.
Was it the government?
It was mainly government because the government was opening to the exterior, like after the Sakoku, right? Like Japan was a closed country. The shogunate fell, then the Meiji Reformation happened. So they were very into like, okay, let's put money into this. Let's try to develop in that period of time black tea Japanese industry. So they invested a lot of money on like bringing people like Tadamoto Kichi outside, bring seeds, building tea schools to make black tea education for farmers. But the breeding itself, on that period of time, they, how to say this in English, they didn't have the notion of like, if I have a plant that is called Yabukita and I make seeds out of it, the seeds will be different. But if I propagate, I will keep the genetic material in a way. They saw everything as a tea plant, not as this plant is genetically different from this other plant, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So every
Yeah, it makes
plant
sense.
was a tea plant. There was no like, oh, this one is more like a Samika, or this plant is more like these traits. They will just like crossbreed, get more seeds, plant them back on the field, and genetic lottery, and that's how they did things. And it was more Tadamoto Kichi and one of his students, which was Sugiyama Hikosaburo, I think is the correct way of saying it. That's basically the guy that discovered or selected or bred Yabukita. So this guy was the first one that say like, no, okay, let's take individual plants. If you do seeds from those plants, the characteristics are not copied from one plant to the other. So we need to have the original plant take cuttings and then reproduce the plants by cuttings. So he was the one that was like, oh yeah, that crazy guy that is propagating plants because he says that the genetic material carries over kind of situation. And he was right. So that's why at the beginning, all this crossbreeding is a little bit more like selecting out of a wild population, because they still didn't develop the method to study crossbreeding like now. Like the cultivars you see now, they are very intentional of like, we have Samidori, we know which are the weaknesses, so we are going to breed it with this other cultivar that we know is resistant to this thing that Samidori is not, and try to get rid of the weakness. There was not that notion that many years ago, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
Do
Fascinating.
people still make new cultivars nowadays?
Yes. I think actually in January last year, the Shizuoka National... Was the national one? No, it was the Prefectural Research Center. They released two new cultivars.
Okay.
I don't remember the names, even though I was there and I was very lucky that I could taste them. It was Tsuyahime, was it?
Cool.
I don't remember the name. I know I brought an article about it. I can find the names later. But it was basically two new cultivars, and sometimes you can just check on the registry of cultivars, and it's like, oh yeah, this farmer, which is a farmer from Kagoshima, has registered the cultivar, and it's like, oh, okay, well, there's a new one now. But you could, as an individual, you could just like go into a Zairai field and say like, this plant is good. And register it. And
it's a new cultivar.
Exactly. They will test it and stuff like that. And you need to provide some documentation, but that's basically what they are doing, right? And there is still some farmers that they grow their own cultivars. It doesn't need to come from the government. Like I think you guys have talked about the Narino cultivar before. So that comes from a Zairai plant.
From Nori.
Hori Shishimi Yen or something like that.
Hori Shichimenen, yeah. Yeah, Hori Shichimenen.
So he has two cultivars, the Narino and the Okunoyama, and they were registered 2000, something like that. Yeah, 2000, I think. And both of them are basically Zairai, and apparently they just kept track of those plants individually. Then they went to the research center and they were like, hey, we have those two plants. This is the study that we did. Can we run tests with you? And then they applied for registration and they got accepted. But on those cases, usually, it's not a cultivar that will be sold to other farmers. Because it's like, in the case of the Narino, it's like double the amino acid content of Yabukita, for example. So it makes sense for you to keep that plant because it's like a good tool that you can use for your products. There is another farmer in Tanegashima, which is an island south of Kagoshima. Is it Tanegashima or the other island? I don't remember. He has the Soju cultivar, I think it's called. And it's an extremely early cultivar. So that guy basically is the first farmer that gets to market every year. Because it's a tea that flushes 2 weeks before anyone else. On top of that, he lives as south of Japan as you can get. So the warm weather also like helps. So I think he might like be harvesting like end of February, beginning of March, something like that, which is crazy.
Whoa,
Wow.
that's super
early.
Because in Kyoto we harvest end of April if it's early, and the first week of May usually. So that's like 3 months before anyone else, basically almost. So it makes sense for him to keep that genetical material, intellectual property for himself, for a while at least.
Can you talk about the registration system in general and like I guess people license out cultivars, but the purpose of the registry is to protect your IP, right? And that's why some cultivars just aren't registered because I guess maybe there's no need to, they don't care about protecting it, or maybe it's too much of a headache.
Yeah, I guess so. Like that's something I'm really digging into right now. I found this 90-page manual on how to apply for a registration, and it's a very thick read. But basically, what they are trying to see, and it depends crop by crop, of course. But it's like, okay, are those genetic traits when you propagate by cuttings, are they stable? Like if they are lost, they are not going to register it. They're not going to accept it as a cultivar. But if you do all the paperwork and the tests are good and you have not commercialized those plants to another country, or you are not selling those plants before registration, they can just like put a stamp. They will give it a registration number, which is the most boring thing that you can see. It's like cultivar 06132. And at the same time, usually they give it a name to make it a little bit more easy to identify as well. So that's where Asatsuyu and Tsuyuhikari and all those names came from. And then you have anywhere between 20 to 30 years, I think it is, where you have the rights to that plant, genetic identity, basically. So if a company that is not necessarily making tea, they are just making the propagation step, so creating baby tea plants, you can license them to like, okay, yeah, you can propagate this plant for me and sell it, basically. Or you can just choose like, no, this plant can only be sold inside this prefecture, or this plant can only be sold to people I decide to license, because it's your work, right? It's like any other intellectual property. That's how it kind of works, right? So it's the same basically with plants.
Makes sense.
You are telling them like, yeah, this plant can be grown anywhere in the country, but you cannot export the plant to outside of Japan. Some plants, they might say like, yeah, this cultivar, you can export it worldwide, no restrictions. Some cultivars like Tsuyuhikari, for example, is very famous because it's an excellent cultivar. It's one of my favorite cultivars. It was bred by the prefectural Shizuoka Tea Research Center. And they were like, yeah, you can plant these in the entirety of Japan. Then something happened. I think it was 2008. And they decided like, no, from now on, until we don't have the rights to the breeding rights anymore, that cultivar can only be grown in Shizuoka, because they can use it as a competitive edge against maybe other prefectures, or they want to boost production in their prefecture before it gets released outside. And I think that's because it's a good relationship to what you guys do with matcha and tencha. I think Tsuyu Hikari is a excellent tea cultivar for sencha and kabuse and all these beautiful things. But I think that they might have discovered that it actually makes excellent matcha as well. So they are like, nope, we are going to keep it for ourselves.
More valuable.
It's a very difficult cultivar to propagate because it doesn't root very well at the beginning. There is a lot of plants dying out on the nursery stage. So I think they are trying to keep all the production as much as possible inside of the prefecture. And I believe they are losing the rights, or they expire 2028. So right now, the only way to get Tsuyu Hikari plants is being in Shizuoka, or people that planted fields of Tsuyu Hikari many years ago, they can of course keep the plants. They just cannot propagate them. That would be like a illegal act.
Interesting.
But you can see Tsuyu Hikari in Nagasaki or in Wazuka. We have a couple of farmers that have it. So they are allowed to keep using those plants, of course. But what they cannot do is propagate the plant.
Interesting. Can the tea leaves harvested from other prefecture being, trade to another prefecture and gets processed?
Yeah, leaves, yes. Probably as aracha, so as already like rough tea. Maybe as fresh, probably as well. But why would you transport fresh leaves? It would probably be a headache. What you cannot trade is the seeds in the case of Tsuyu Hikari, for example. Sorry, not seeds, cuttings. But leaf, it shouldn't be a problem. I think that's how Kagoshima was selling a lot of tea to Shizuoka many years ago, until they decided to just like go on their own, and it's going very well for them. There is a lot of there used to be a lot of trade between prefectures, like leaf-wise, if they didn't have an auction of their own or something like that.
Yeah. At dinner, you were telling us that to really understand the different growing regions of tea and the different terroirs of tea in Japan, it's really a story of cultivars. Is this IP system like one part of that story, but are there other parts to that story as well?
Well, it's connected, like the Tsuyu Hikari case, for example, right? Like it was bred in Shizuoka, so of course, natural selection of the environment will kind of like filter out plants that don't do well in that environment, if that makes sense. But then that Tsuyu Hikari, for example, they have a very strong partnership with Omaezaki City, and that's basically farming wise is Tsuyu Hikari City. It was a variety extremely promoted into the farmers of that city as a project to kind of give a boost to the aging farming economy at that time. So it can be like the influence through there. It can be sometimes just the identity of the prefecture. So most of the Saitama cultivars, so Sai something, naturally, because they are bred there, they are extremely resistant to frost because it's a very cold region.
Okay.
So that gives their identity. They might not be the most quotes unquote like tasty ones, but they are usually like super hardy plants. If you go to Kagoshima, it's a very hot environment. The plants don't suffer that much from frost, but they have all these like very early growing cultivars because the environment of the region kind of has more hot environment. It promotes early growth of the plant. So geography wise, the plants will behave slightly different, but also sometimes you have interesting cases like Yutaka Midori is the second most grown cultivar in Japan. It's originally from Shizuoka, and it never got registered because it's kind of like following the processing methods of the time. It was kind of bitter and like very rough. Some researcher decided to just bring it down to Kagoshima. It didn't make a good impression at the beginning, but until they figure out how to really processing it, and now it's basically all the Yutaka Midori is grown down there. So it's a plant that maybe doesn't do well in one place. It gets moved to another prefecture. Sometimes you have to change your mentality around that plant, and then it makes super well. Some of them are just like the Narino, like it's farmers that are very passionate about breeding plants just for fun, and they, by genetic lottery, they get something like super spectacular, and that gets recognized as an excellent cultivar. Like, I think it's Asahi or one of the Kyokens as well. It was like a farmer that just had it, growed it, donated it to the research center, and the research center was like, "Oh, okay, this is actually like excellent cultivar. Let's promote it inside of the prefecture." So sometimes it's also the effort of an individual farmer can like kind of affect the entire farming inside of a prefecture.
Wow, this is fascinating. This world is so deep.
At the end of the day, like there is humans selecting plants, and those humans also have histories, and the research centers have histories of their own and things that they look for and things that they don't look for. So every research center also has its own personality, and the plants that get out of there also have different traits. So that's what I meant by the geography is very interconnected between the plants and the farmers and the industry, because, I don't know, the plant affects the industry affects the farmer, but the farmer can make like a new plant that can affect the industry, and it's like this loop. So it's kind of interesting.
Very cool. We're learning a lot.
How do you acquire all these information in general? Like, do you read a lot of papers, or do you just talk to farmers and they would tell you all these things?
Yes, it's a combination of many things. So there is for the registered cultivars is a little bit more easy because it's a public registry. You just go to the database of the government, look for Camellia sinensis, whatever, and it will just like blob a very, very ugly Excel sheet that you have to also learn how to decipher. But there you can see name, where it was bred, by who, at what year, registration number, expiration date of the rights. For the unregistered ones, usually you have to ask more questions. Sometimes you can just search for, in Google, name of the cultivar, sencha, like, I don't know, Ushihikari, I don't know, it's an unregistered one, right? Ushihikari, matcha, Kyoto, and find a farmer that is selling it, and just send them an email, call them, like, hey, so I'm wondering about this cultivar, and they are like, who are you? Can I come visit your farm one day? Blah, 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 and then just ask questions and kind of like pull the string from there. Sometimes you can just like shoot an email to the research center that developed the cultivar, and they can give you some pointers. There is a beautiful cultivar book as well. It's only in Japanese, and it's not something that you can buy outside of Japan, unfortunately. I don't know why. But it has maybe like, I don't know, 60, 70 of them, I would say, maybe more. It's very basic information, but it's full of photos and like who bred it, and that's also a very important tool for me using this book. But if you go to you go to my website, I have a link. It's a Japanese tea cultivar list, I think. And I have listed every single governmental website I use to research the cultivars. Any of those websites, you probably can put a name and it will give you some sort of information.
Very cool.
Yeah, very cool. Very interesting. Sounds like a lot to sort through too.
Yeah, it's taken many hours and many hitting the wall with the head of like, why is everything in Japanese and so like rudimentary sometimes. But now I think there is these 2-3 more scientific oriented websites run by Japanese government or scientific associations that are very useful. So you just need to know where to look for answers, I guess, and then enough Japanese to be able to kind of parse the information a little bit. But yeah, I wish there was like more sources in English as well. There's two very good ones, like Ricardo. I think you guys interviewed him. His website is amazing in English.
Yeah.
And also there is Florian as well. He has like a very big list of Japanese cultivars out there in English as well. But is like, where do we get that information? Is like a lot of like Google typing in Japanese and shooting in the dark and translating.
Got it.
Thank you for doing all of this.
Yes, thank you. There's so many interesting stories when it comes to cultivars.
Some of the cultivars have such deep personal history sometimes, which was so surprising.
It'd be really cool to start moving some of these stories to be more consumer facing. Because like you can tell the story of a farmer or a region, but also telling the story of a cultivar that they're drinking and how it came to exist is just such a cool thing that adds dimensionality to matcha or Japanese tea in general as a specialty product. I'd love it if we could bring more of these stories closer to the consumer.
Yeah, I think so, because also like apart from the cultivar, like putting that on the side, like as you can call it a specialty product, you can call it like luxury product, like whatever is the vocabulary that industry uses. At the end of the day, there is a farmer behind it, just showcasing their histories. Sometimes, especially in Japan, it's like, I don't know, 16 generation farmer. It's like that is crazy. Like,
Yeah.
how do you surface that? It gives like a lot of like background information of like, okay, this might be not the most crazy expensive tea or crazy cheap tea that you will ever have, but you feel a connection with the farmer, and that can make an impact in their family at the end of the day. And I think that's the most important part with specialty products. At the end of the day, is like recognizing the product as a specialty, but the work of that farmer to make that product a specialty. And I think that sometimes gets a little bit like lost when it comes to Europe or America or
Absolutely.
whatever.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Understanding all the people behind the product and the story of how it basically came to exist. So before we wrap up, what would you consider to be one of the more underappreciated cultivars when it comes to tencha cultivation and for matcha?
Wow.
That people may or may not have heard of.
For tencha is too specific to single it out, but I think Aichi is a sleeping giant. They produce a lot of tencha, like more like bulk industrial production. They are very held back by some, I don't know, industry situation down there. I don't know why. And Kagoshima, I think it has exploded so much into the matcha world as well. They have put out a cultivar in the 2016. It's called Seimei. So I think it's, let me check my notes. 2016. So 2016, put it 4 years for planting. That would be 2020. And then another 3-4 years for the farmers to figure. Yeah, it will come up more soon, I think. And I think it could be like what will do a flip for the Kagoshima industry in the sense of tencha, I think. So we see it Kagoshima as a more like an industrial site, but they are using the tools that they have at their disposal, right? So I think this new Seimei will appear anytime from now on, and it could really make an impact. If it's inside of Kyoto Prefecture, which is what I know a little bit more, of course we know about Goko and Asahi and all these more famous ones, but I think Temmyo is a cultivar that is not super known out there. I don't know if it's even registered. I think it might be one of the few ones that is registered. It's extremely tasty. It was recommended to me by a friend, and it's extremely milky and creamy, and like Goko has like this kind of like texture experience to it that I think almost no one grows it yet, because from 2000 something. That really blew my mind. The Narino blew my mind, but Tenmyo blew it in another sense. Like the textural experience, the creaminess, the softness, the sweetness was like a very very nice velvety cultivar. I wish there were more people. And I think inside of Kyoto, I've only found so far 2 farmers that have it. So I hope it spreads a little bit more.
I don't think I've ever tried that, Ryan. Have you?
Yeah, me neither.
I didn't know it existed until that friend was like, "Have you ever heard of Tenmyo?" I was like, "Let me check in my notes." Like, "Oh yeah, there is something called Tenmyo, but I never tried it." And I was like, "Okay, go to this guy, ask him for Tenmyo, and then you call me and you tell me what did you feel." I was like, "Okay." And yes, it was. But maybe it's also
That
like
sounds
I
amazing.
haven't seen it
Yeah.
as a single cultivar product out there too much. Maybe it's in blends or whatever.
I'd love to see it as a single cultivar product. Sounds really good.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and for all the work you're doing at Tea Nursery. It's really a gift to the tea world.
Oh, thank you guys. Thank you for the opportunity. It's always nice to just like nerd out about plants with someone else. I don't get the opportunity too much, so it's awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much. And for anyone listening, if you enjoyed this podcast, please check out Tea Nursery, the website. It's a wonderful resource to learn more about cultivars and the history and even the different growing regions around Japan. A lot of great resource links there too. And if you enjoyed this podcast in general, please consider sharing it with a friend or giving us 5 stars. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.
See you in the future.
Bye.